Hi everybody, welcome back to English 116, and this is for our class for Wednesday, the 16th. As you know, we didn't have class on Monday, that was Native Indigenous Day, and we are at the point now where we are transitioning out of our fiction section and into our drama section, and also getting ready for the submission of our first paper. And certainly you can submit in papers early because I have a rolling deadline. But our due date I had identified midway through this semester, which would be Monday the 21st, if I'm correct. Paper number 1 due on short story and film with early papers encouraged. So I wanted you to be able to think a little bit about the idea of the first paper. And in our syllabus and other documents folder, you will see that I have posted our syllabus, which also includes criteria for essay evaluation, which is a way to conceptualize the distinction between different grades, that an A has a central idea with originality and depth of thought and a consistent sense of audience. The topic is developed with clear and logical and support. And that organization is sound. Paragraphs have supporting ideas, or each paragraph has a core idea, I should say, supported by fitting examples and illustrations. And then paragraphs basically have connections between them. And the sentences are well put together, are varied, and there are very few errors, if common errors in grammar, punctuation, and spelling. And that would be an excellent. A B paper would be a paper that has a clearly stated central idea, doesn't necessarily have the energy or the depth of thought of the A paper. It draws safe conclusions, but the topic is interesting, focused adequately, logically developed. Organization is correct and logical, but sometimes it strains a bit. Each paragraph has a central idea, though, with examples or illustrations and a logical point, but there may not necessarily always be clear transitions between paragraphs. And there's little variety in sense and structure. We're beginning to see a few errors in grammar, spelling, and punctuation. As opposed to the C, or the satisfactory, where there's a reasonably clear central idea and adequate grasp of the reason for the assignment, such as direction or description or persuasion, but focus is blurred in some places. The development with examples or illustrations is sketchy in some spots. Organization isn't always clear. Most paragraphs have a sense of organization, but development can be vague, transitions can be awkward or lacking, and there's some patterns of mistakes now in grammar, spelling, and punctuation. The D paper doesn't necessarily state or develop a central idea, though the pattern shows the writer has some central concept. The sense of audience is inconsistent. Organization can be difficult to follow. Frequently, paragraphs seem to lack a central idea. Transitions can be scanty or absent. Sentences can be awkward or incorrectly constructed. The writing does not indicate college level proficiency, with frequent errors in grammar, punctuation, and spelling. And then lastly, the F paper with no central idea, no connection to a single topic. Writing can be contradictory and characterized by many changes of subject, no evidence of overall editing or writing beyond the first draft. Most sentences have errors in their construction. Paragraphing can be haphazard or non-existent, with many errors in grammar, punctuation, and spelling. But as you know, you will have the option of rewriting that first paper. So I just ask that you submit in the original evaluated copy with my commentary along with your revision. You would have up until the ending of the semester to do so. And then you can get the higher of the two grades. And in terms of the submission of your paper, I ask that you do so via email to my email address, which is ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. It's how my grading program works best. And we talked a little bit about some of the conventions for quoting. I can't remember if I had talked about using square brackets within a quote. When you add square brackets within a quote, that is your addition to the quote, usually to clarify something, for instance, a pronoun. And you don't need to do that at the beginning or the ending of the quote. Obviously, you can comment on the beginning or the ending on your own, but within the quote itself, if you thought something needed to be clarified, not analyzed. Think of the square brackets almost as interrupting conversation. It's something that you don't do unless it's absolutely necessary. And you can do the opposite within a quote too, and it's called an ellipsis, fondly known as the three periods or the three dots. That in between the starting point and ending point of your quote, and you get to decide where to begin your quote and end your quote, even if it's a mid sentence, you can do that. But in between that start and end point, if you were to leave out a word or several words, then you would use an ellipsis, those three periods or three dots. And what you're leaving out is not supposed to be relevant. You certainly wouldn't leave out something that changes the meaning of the quote. That would be unethical. So, again, we could talk and talk and talk about how to write a paper. Your textbook talks about it. I talked about it. I've suggested some websites, Purdue OWL, the GCC library site. But in the end, you have to write your own paper, and I need to be able to see it and give commentary on it, which is why ultimately everybody has the option of rerunning that first paper if they elect to do so. But you're not required to, so if you're happy with the grade that you earn on that paper, you can just stop at that point. And in terms of thinking about that first paper, I had given you 4 suggestions of topics, and they were either topics that in one way or another examined canon, those works considered by scholars or critics worthy of literary study, or contemporary relevance, those works that still have relevance to our own society, and that is an element of canon that something has contemporary relevance, but there are many other elements associated with canon as well. And the contemporary relevance question can be somewhat challenging because you don't want to end up writing a paper about our own society. You want to end up writing a paper about the text that you are analyzing and using just some examples from our society. But don't lose the focus of what the paper is about, your analysis of something from the fiction section, which could be Citizen Kane, which is how we began this semester. And if you are going to be discussing Citizen Kane, then when you are quoting from Citizen Kane, you would be using a timestamp in your parenthetical documentation for that particular quote. If you decide to write one of the short stories that we've discussed in the fiction section, the convention is that you're using a page number. If you're using an online source, you use the author's last name. And all of this is supposed to work by adding in a works cited page at the ending, where basically what you've done is you've listed all of the resources you've used to quote from in your paper. And you list them all by author, director, and by in alphabetical order. If you're just writing on the text itself, I'm suggesting that this be a critical paper and that you don't use outside resources, then you don't need to submit in a works cited page. But if you do submit in a works cited page, then make sure that you're formatting it correctly. Again, you can look that up through various sites such as Purdue OWL or the GCC library. And also, you aren't necessarily limited to the suggested paper topics that I've given you. You can write on your own paper topic if it addresses one of the texts from the fiction section and if it's a topic that's approved by me. So I hope you're in the midst right now of working on your paper. And in terms of thinking about our drama section, I had given you just some brief ideas about focusing on stage directions and character names when you're reading a drama, because reading a drama is a very different sort of animal than actually watching it, and we will be doing both in class. Probably your most familiar experiences with watching drama have been film dramas on something like television, and in fact, the textbook gives you a brief example from a television series by the title of Seinfeld that you might be familiar with. It was a situation comedy. And they give you that example as a way to illustrate the difference between reading a script and then actually watching it performed. So I was able to actually find a little bit of a clip on YouTube. The portion of the script that they offer you is called The Pitch, and it basically is about the central characters making a pitch to a television studio about how they want to write a television series. And it's a very meta episode because we're watching a television series from the network that these characters are making that pitch to. That's part of the underlying humor. But if you were to just read that, and then of course if you were to see it acted out, there's two very different experiences. And obviously, those of you who have some understanding of Seinfeld, you've got an advantage when you're reading it because ultimately you know how those characters would respond and act. And if you actually saw the episode The Pitch, you'd have even more of an advantage. If you know nothing about Seinfeld, obviously it's going to be much more difficult for you. So, in terms of thinking about that and how to translate over to what we are doing, that yes, you are probably going to have to work harder with reading the dramas than you would be with watching the dramas, but we will be doing both, and you will have the option on writing on either performance or text when it comes time to write a paper about drama. So just briefly, some of the elements of drama, because dramas are longer than short stories. They are divided into acts, which are the main divisions of the play. Those acts are divided into scenes. These are divisions in the act to indicate a new location or the introduction of a new character. Expect multiple plots, not just the main plot, but a subplot, a secondary plot, and it should in one way or another be connected with the main plot. The stage directions that I told you are going to be so important for you to read because this is the only information you're going to get from the playwright about how this play should be acted on stage. And expect a rise and fall of action, almost like a pyramid structure. We'll talk about this pyramid structure actually when we talk about Shakespeare, our next drama after Oedipus the King, a rising and falling of action, which I think is something that you can expect in most pieces of literature. There are questions about drama that you can ask yourself that are listed in our textbook. Good news. Many of those questions are very similar to the questions that you would ask yourself in the fiction section. So, who is the author? When is the time period? What is the significance of the title? Who are the characters? How do they change? What is the setting? How is it important? Could it be symbolic? What unique language is used? What kind of repetition in language is used? All of that is going to be very similar. Some of the differences, of course, are in relation to just theater itself. And this is where I wanted to talk about our first drama, which is going to be Oedipus the King, which is a very old drama, 430 BC Greece. So, usually in dramatic sections or in sections about drama, we begin with Oedipus the King. It's so important historically because it helped to lay out the tragic tradition of what we expect with tragedy. And you might be familiar with someone named Aristotle, a philosopher, but also perhaps an early literary critic, where he identified the elements of tragedy and, in fact, even identified Oedipus the King as the greatest example of tragedy. But let me talk a little bit about the author Sophocles, who lived in the 400s BC in Athens, Greece. He was a statesman, he was a general, he was a dramatist. There are over 120 play fragments, a handful are intact. Luckily, Oedipus the King is one of them. And in fact, Oedipus is part of a trilogy, a three-part series. We're reading the first part, Oedipus the King. The story continues, even though we won't continue to read the story, with Antigone, the second part of the story being of Antigone, who is Oedipus's daughter, years after Oedipus the King ends. So now she's an adult because she's a little girl in the beginning of the play. And then finally, the trilogy ends with Oedipus at Colonus when he is an old man, so many years have gone by. So that's it. It almost reminds me of the Star Wars saga, that there are lots of pieces to it. They may not necessarily have even appeared in chronological order, but if you put them all together, they tell a bigger story. And we're beginning with Oedipus because that's the first in the chronology, and of course has been identified by Aristotle as perhaps the greatest example of tragedy. Oedipus the king took some rather bold risks for the time period. For instance, adding a third actor on stage at the same time, which would not seem to be bold from our modern day perspective. But what we really have to do is think about the theaters of the time, where they would not have had the technology that we have today. Plays at the time were religious festivals. So that was one of the important elements of a play, specifically to Dionysus, the god of wine and fertility. But they were also funded by the state. How nice is that? The state funding the arts, eh? So they were meant to reinforce religious and community values. And plays were performed in Greek amphitheaters. And these were basically theaters that were built into hillsides, into rock, rows of rising seats, over 14,000 could watch. And of course, they wouldn't have electricity, and they wouldn't have microphones, and they wouldn't have lighting, and they wouldn't have all of the modern technology that we expect today. So think about the difficulty of being able to see what's happening on stage, which is the reason why they would usually limit it to two major actors on stage at the same time, so we could differentiate between the two. So adding a third added a particular level of complexity. The actors also would have very unfamiliar conventions based on our own acting techniques. Again, because of the limitations of the theater. They would wear large padded costumes, for instance, that would be very colorful, and platform shoes, so they would be more visible on stage. They would also wear masks that would cover their faces, but would also show a particular facial expression so that you could differentiate the actors more easily. There were probably amplification devices in those masks to help with audio. Though, if you know anything about the Greek amphitheaters, they were marvels of acoustics. So that also helped in terms of audio. And there would also be a chorus, and this would be a group of individuals who would chant their dialogue. And of course, that would increase the audio if everyone was chanting at the same time. And this group could represent the populace or the citizenry, where they were commenting on action, but also responding to action. So, in some ways, they could be like the narrator commenting on action, but they could also be like the extras, if you will, in a movie, responding to action. And there was a convention at the time that was known as Deus Ex Machina, God from the Machine. This would have been any kind of mechanical stage device that would have been used at the time. For instance, a rope with pulleys to lower character on the stage, let's say from heaven. Now, that term has come to mean any artificial device that's used to put resolution to a play. For instance, at the ending of the play, having the character or movie, whatever the case may happen to be, story, that the character realizes that everything that occurred was just a dream, which is a pretty easy cop out, I suppose, in terms of justifying events that don't necessarily seem realistic or possible. And what you can expect in these plays is an examination of excessive pride, which would be known as hubris, and the punishment that would occur to a character that would exhibit excessive pride. And we should feel, according to Aristotle, pity and fear. And that would occur through catharsis, which is a psychological term of the purging of emotions. The idea that we get to experience the journey with the character, but in a safe way, because it's not realistic. It's obviously fiction. And the reason why we feel pity is because the character's a good person. In fact, they're more than just a good person. They are above and beyond the ordinary, someone we can admire and respect. And they experience a downfall, which is why it's tragic. And that downfall occurs for two reasons. And the first is because of the character's own flaws, the errors that they commit. So this is the instructional element of the play. Don't duplicate the errors of the main character. But there also is something that is known as an outside force, something that cannot be controlled by the individual. Usually at this time it would be referenced as fate. We might use contemporary words like luck, but the reality is the same, that you can't control everything. So while we certainly feel pity for this character because they're a great person and they tried, certainly not to engage in negative behavior, we also feel fear. At least according to Aristotle, we're supposed to feel fear that if this could happen to that character and they are so superior to us, then the same could happen to us, probably much worse. And, which seems like a kind of odd convention at the time, the audience would know the plot prior to the play. So when they were watching the play, they wouldn't need to rely on the play itself in order to understand the events that were occurring. They already knew what was going to occur. So again, that alleviated some of the challenges of watching a play and being able to see it in a Greek amphitheater. It also highlights one of the major elements that you will see in Oedipus the King, irony, that we as audience know the ending story in a way that Oedipus does it. So he is a tragic hero because he's a great man and he experiences a downfall because of his flaws, and expect hubris or excessive pride to be some of those flaws, but also outside forces such as fate. And as a tragic hero, he ultimately accepts responsibility for his flaws and acts accordingly. Keep that in mind when we are reading and watching Oedipus the King, the acceptance of responsibility, and that the character should engage in necessary and probable actions based on the limitations, of course, of what we can expect on stage. So they should be as realistic as possible as a character can be. But understand, when we're watching a performance from 430 BC, the actions would be quite exaggerated, almost like a silent film, so that, again, we wouldn't necessarily have to rely on dialogue. So, in terms of Oedipus the King, you might perhaps know Oedipus through psychology. Sigmund Freud was a fan of literature and was inspired by Oedipus the King to come up with a famous theory entitled the Oedipal complex, which is loosely, and I mean loosely, based on Oedipus the King. The Oedipal complex being somewhat similar to the play, but very, very different. And if you think about the actual play itself, understand that what we are reading is a translation and what we are watching is a translation. It would have been written in Greek, so we can never know exactly unless we read it in the original. Translations always lead to difficulties because you can't necessarily get an exact translation word for word in another language. Oedipus makes it even more difficult because Oedipus was written in poetry. So now what you're trying to do is to translate plot, but also translate sound, which is what poetry is based on, in another language. So it's an inexact science when you're a translator to keep to the plot, the action, but also to honor the sounds of the words as well. So you'll see and read lots of different translations. You have one in your textbook. I've provided another as a link. But since the audience already knew the plot, it was less about the specific language and it was more about the themes that we would expect in the play and also our appreciation of the irony. Now, in terms of the play, I had indicated that the audience would know the plot, so I wanted to share the plot with you, which is also included in your textbook. And the plot is that the play Oedipus the King begins in media res, which means in the middle. And Oedipus is a king. Makes sense based on the title. And his community is experiencing a plague. And the assumption is that they are suffering from plague because they've offended the gods. Gods in the plural, Again, it was a very different time and culture and society. So Oedipus sends out trusted advisors to speak to oracles and prophets to see how they've offended the gods. And everybody comes back with the same answer, that Oedipus himself is responsible. And he becomes angrier and angrier, more paranoid and more suspicious. So much so that when his own brother-in-law comes back with that declaration that Oedipus is responsible, Oedipus accuses his brother-in-law, whose name is Creon, of trying to steal the kingdom from him. And Creon says, "Why would I want your kingdom, Oedipus? I've got all of the advantages of being in royalty without any of the responsibilities." Well, nevertheless, a blind prophet, again, there's a lot of irony here, is called to talk to Oedipus. The prophet, it has insight, so he's able to see, but he's blind. So he doesn't have physical vision. And vision and sight, major issue and the major theme in the play. And the blind prophet Tiresias also tells Oedipus that he's responsible. And lo and behold, as the play progresses, we find out that Oedipus was indeed responsible when we get some backstory, some exposition. And the backstory starts all the way with Oedipus's birth parents, whom, after Oedipus was born, went to an oracle, which was common at the time, in order to see their child's future. And they were told that their son would eventually grow up to kill his father and marry his mother. Parents are horrified and decide that they need to prevent this at all costs. So they give the child to one of their servants with instructions to kill the child. And the servant doesn't have the heart to do so. The servant ends up abandoning the child. In some versions, the servant gives the child to another servant from another kingdom. But regardless, this baby is taken to another kingdom. And this kingdom, the king and the queen, are unable to have children. So they're thrilled to be presented with this baby, and they raise it as their own, never telling this baby that he is adopted. That baby turns into a man, Oedipus. And Oedipus, as a man, approaches the oracle in order to learn his future, and he's told that he will one day kill his father and marry his mother. And Oedipus is horrified, and as a good man, wants to prevent it at all costs. So he decides to leave home and put as much physical distance between himself and his parents. Unbeknownst to him, the people who he thinks are his parents are merely his adopted parents, not his biological parents. The end result of all of this is that when Oedipus continues on his journey, at one point he's at a crossroads. That'll be literal and figurative. There is a chariot blocking his way, and in a fit of anger, one of Oedipus's flaws, he kills everyone in the chariot. Or as one of my former students had once said, perhaps this is the earliest example of road rage that we can identify in literature. But nevertheless, yes, indeed, it turns out that one of the people in that chariot was Oedipus's biological father. And then Oedipus comes to a kingdom that's newly lost its king and is being ravaged by plague. This time it's because of a monstrosity called the Sphinx. And the only way to defeat this monster is to solve its riddle. Old literary tradition that the way you defeat monsters is by answering riddles. The riddle, by the way, happens to be what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs in the afternoon, 3 in the evening. No one's able to solve it except Oedipus, illustrating his great intelligence. And the answer is man, by the way. 4 legs in the morning would be a baby crawling. 2 legs in the afternoon would be an adult walking. And 3 legs in the evening would be old age walking with a king. So it turns out that Oedipus saves the community, and as a reward, he's given the kingship. After all, their king was recently killed. And that means that he gets to marry the newly widowed queen. And yes, they have children together, and everything is wonderful until the plague begins to ravage their community, which is how the play Oedipus the King starts. And Oedipus learns that the woman that he married was indeed his biological mother. And Oedipus is a tough play for us to understand from contemporary standards because we usually think of the ancestral relationship as being a sin. The bigger sin is trying to outwit the gods, having enough hubris, enough arrogance to think that you can change your fate rather than humbly accepting it. Because the irony is that all of this happens because of attempts to change fate, whether those be attempts through Oedipus's parents, his birth parents first of all, or Oedipus himself. If they had humbly accepted their fate, this might not have even happened. But nevertheless, we're at the ending of the play, Oedipus the King, and the truth has been revealed. And it's so horrific to Oedipus's wife slash mother, her name is Jocasta, that she commits suicide. And that's why she can never be considered to be a tragic hero, not only because she doesn't have superior intelligence like Oedipus, but more importantly, she does not accept responsibility for her role in this tragedy. Oedipus gouges out his eyes. And the idea of vision and blindness and being able to see and not see is a major theme in the play. So thematically it's significant, but it's also significant in that he punishes himself. He's willing to accept responsibility for his deeds. The result is that he's going to be exiled from the community. And of all people, it's Creon, his brother-in-law, whom Oedipus had accused of trying to steal the kingdom. Creon is going to be basically taking over the kingdom and is entrusted with Oedipus's children, one of them being Antigone, and that happens to be the second play that we will be reading, Antigone, or the second play that could be read in the trilogy, I should say, Antigone. We won't be reading that. We are reading Oedipus, and then we're moving forward in time. We're going to England, and we're going to the 1500s, and we'll talk a little bit about Shakespeare, who was very much aware of the elements of what was considered to be a great tragedy, and would utilize those elements in his own famous tragedies, such as Macbeth and Othello and King Lear. And Shakespeare is probably best known for his tragedies, even more so than for any of his other genres. That said, Shakespeare liked to break the rules. So while there are rules for what a tragic character should or should not do, Shakespeare would sometimes play with the formula a little bit. But that's the reason why we read Oedipus the King, is because it establishes the tragic tradition, which is so important in theater and in drama. We read Oedipus the King because it's become so important in psychology, because Sigmund Freud was inspired by the play. Even though the Oedipal complex isn't exactly like the play, the Oedipal complex indicates that boys are attracted to their mothers and see their father as competition. That's not exactly what happens at Oedipus the King, but it was close enough for Freud to take the term. And if you know anything about Freud, then you know about the Electra complex, where he also had a theory that girls were attracted to their fathers and saw their mothers as competition. Freud's theories have fallen out of favor for some, I think, obvious reasons. But as the father of psychology, he's usually studied, again, because of his importance. And I guess you can say that we study Oedipus the King, again, as its importance in terms of establishing tragedy and tragic tradition. So what I've done in the notes below is I've given you a brief clip from Seinfeld that I encourage you to watch. That's in the B section, drama in popular forms. This is drama that's written primarily for entertainment and profit. Probably doesn't have the kind of depth or complexity that you would expect when you are studying something in an academic classroom. But you probably have more experience with that. Much like we began our fiction section talking about Harlequin romances. Not to disparage Seinfeld or a Harlequin romance, but I think you can see there is a difference between that and something like, let's say, Oedipus the King. So that it really does require not just watching, but reading, so that we can appreciate some of the subtleties in the play. Even though we're reading almost always translations, unless we're fluent in Greek, so we're not getting the exact language the way we would with Shakespeare, our next play, or our third play, which happens to be Raisin in the Sun. And what would be ideal, though I know the world isn't always ideal, is that you would have read Oedipus the King in its entirety by the time we start talking about it next class. And of course, we'll watch performance and so forth. And we've got multiple classes devoted to it, so that you're at home preparing by reading the next play during that time, which will ultimately be A Midsummer Night's Dream. So that when we talk about A Midsummer Night's Dream, you would have read it in its entirety. So as we have multiple classes devoted to Midsummer Night's Dream, because it is long, then you are at home reading the last play, which is Raisin in the Sun, where we have then multiple classes devoted to Raisin in the Sun. And no, you're not home reading the next play. We would have been done with drama at that point. You will be reading poetry and working on your second paper, which will be on drama, with similar kinds of questions about canon or about contemporary relevance. But you can certainly create your own topic as well. And you can focus on either performance or you can focus on text. So the performance we're going to see of Oedipus, I can tell you right now, what they try to do is to duplicate as much as possible what we would have seen in 430 BC in a Greek amphitheater. So it's going to be a very different experience. And to prepare you for that, you'll see in the G section of the notes below, I have a 4-minute video that I would like you to watch about the Greek amphitheaters to give you an idea of what theater houses would have been like for a performance. Now, if you are reading the sections of the textbook that I had assigned, you'll note that many of these readings are not available online for free, unfortunately. However, you can always access the book on reserve in the GCC library. The good news is that you can access the plays themselves, such as Oedipus the King, for free, and I have included that link. But if you're reading the book, you'll note that one of the things that they showed you in terms of how to read a play and write about a play is they used an example from a play called Trifles, which is a very short play, and in that way it's quite unusual. It's only one act. And this particular play has many of the elements that you would expect in a short story. In fact, it's so similar to a short story that they took this one-act play and actually wrote it out as a short story so that you can see the similarities to and the differences from a short story and a dramatic performance. To kind of illustrate again that you have to think about things like stage directions and characterization and the difficulties in being able to realize what a character's thoughts are when you aren't reading, when you're watching something acted out on stage, or you're just even reading the screenplay, because it's much more difficult for the playwright to be able to articulate what a character is thinking. They either have to say their thoughts out loud, or there has to be a voiceover, or there has to be some sort of a device to do that. Trifles is a great play, so I encourage you to read it. It basically is the story about trifles, things that seem to be unimportant, with a murder scene where law enforcement and their wives happen to come to a murder scene to determine if they can find the killer. And it turns out that the wives, by looking at trifles, things that are seemingly unimportant, are able to figure out who the murderer is. Basically, the wife is the murderer, and the motive, that the wife had been the victim of domestic abuse, which is why she killed her husband. And then the wives make the ultimate decision not to tell their husbands, the law enforcement officials, what they know, because the woman, the murderer, was a victim of domestic abuse. It's a play that very much has themes that are similar to some of the texts that we've talked about this semester, such as The Story of an Hour or A Sorrowful Woman, about the role of female in society in the past. But that's just an example. They give you an example of how you can take notes on that, right, from identifying the title and the names of the characters and some of the symbolic references in there, to actually writing a sample paper, which eventually you would be doing. So where this puts us now is thinking about, well, Oedipus the King. And because you have a paper due, there is no attendance question today. You're welcome. So I hope you are doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.